Yes, the lads and the lasses. Right, this video is about St George's, the old mental health hospital in Stafford. Anyway, I hold a deep personal hatred for this place. Like seriously, I'm only gutted that it didn't burn down 25 years ago before they took care of my pal. I understand just how controversial this place is, but you need to understand that I can't please everyone. I'm trying to put content out there that people enjoy, but there's always going to be someone that don't. It is what it is. If you don't like it, I apologise. If you do like it, then thanks for watching. Anyway, let's get into it, guys.
When Stafford's County Asylum opened in 1818, the people who passed through its doors were recorded with a foreignness that can feel almost uncomfortable today. Their age, occupation and physical conditions were written down, along with the supposed cause of their illness, whether they were considered suicidal or dangerous, and eventually whether they recovered, were transferred elsewhere or even died. By the later 19th century, some patients were even photographed for the casebooks. What those records give us now is something much more valuable than another history of an old asylum, because behind these statistics are individual lives, and occasionally enough survives for us to follow somebody from the outside world through the doors of Stafford Asylum and in some cases back out again. One of those people was Bera Littleford. She'd been born Bertha Booth in Shropshire in 1865, and by the time she entered Stafford Asylum in May of 1894, her life had already involved considerable upheaval. Her mother had died when Bertha was very young. She'd worked as a domestic servant, married John Littleford and moved around as the family followed work. By 1894 she had young children of her own, but according to the asylum casebook, the family had fallen on difficult times, and Bertha's physical health was poor. But most importantly, she'd recently heartbreakingly lost a young child. The admission record gives us an unusually direct picture of what happened afterwards. Bertha had gradually lost interest in looking after her home, sometimes refused food and slept badly. Doctors described her as dull and melancholy, and recorded that she believed she'd committed some terrible sin and that the devil was pursuing her. She'd also attempted to strangle herself. The doctors noted a family history of mental illness and described her condition as hereditary, but the death of a child was clearly regarded as an important part of the collapse that had brought her to Stafford. Reading more than 130 years later, some of the language belongs unmistakably to Victorian psychiatry, but the circumstances surrounding Bertha felt much more familiar. This was a young woman whose health had deteriorated after bereavement, while her family was already struggling financially. Whatever diagnosis we might apply today, the record shows someone who had reached a point where those around her believed that she could no longer safely remain home. Whatever diagnosis we might apply today, the records show that somebody had reached a point where those around her believed that she could no longer safely return home. Bertha did eventually improve enough to leave Stafford Asylum, but that was not the end of her story. In August of 1899 she was admitted again. By then she was working as a charwoman and was described as thin, worn and in poor physical condition. This time the notes described her as excited, noisy and incoherent. Once again she recovered sufficiently to be discharged, leaving the asylum in July of 1900. She died only 5 years later in 1905 at the age of 39. The surviving research does not establish whether her death was connected in any way with her mental health, so we cannot take the story further than evidence allows. What the records do show is a woman who entered Stafford Asylum twice during the periods of when her life and health had badly deteriorated, and on both occasions she eventually returned to the outside world. Another patient arrived at the same asylum in May of 1895, only a year after Bertha's first admission. Her name was Mary Gegg. She was 55 years old, married and described simply as an housewife. Mary had attempted to take her own life and was diagnosed with what the doctors called melancholia, a term once used for conditions involving profound depression. But Mary's case is particularly valuable because the case notes preserve some of her own words. She told those treating her that she'd been rather depressed and miserable, and several days later she said that she felt like she was a trouble to everyone. They were very ordinary words, which perhaps makes them more affecting. There's no elaborate Victorian description needed to understand what Mary was trying to communicate. The surviving notes don't indicate that she underwent any dramatic form of treatment. The Staffordshire Archives researchers found evidence of observation, diet and removal from a usual routine. While her physical health gradually improved, her mental state appears to have improved alongside it. And on the 22nd of July 1895, little more than 2 months after she had entered Stafford Asylum following a suicide attempt, Mary Gegg was discharged and recovered. Her experience matters because it complicates the image we often have of Victorian asylums. Some people undoubtedly remain institutionalised for many years, and others never return home. But admission did not automatically mean a lifetime behind walls. Mary entered during a severe mental health crisis and left within weeks. More than a century later, even the researchers studying a case were left wondering whether rest, regular food and temporary relief from her ordinary circumstances had contributed to her recovery, although the surviving evidence cannot give us a definite answer. The records also tell us something about what happened to somebody when they first arrived. By the late 19th century, admissions had become increasingly standardised. Personal information was entered into registers. Medical history was recorded and questions were asked about previous attacks of mental illness, epilepsy, suicidal behaviour and whether the person posed a danger to others. Patients underwent a physical examination. Their belongings were taken into storage and they were bathed before being issued with clothing for use inside the asylum. From the 1880s onwards, some were also photographed, which is why faces such as Bertha Littleford survive alongside the written case notes. Life inside was ordered around routine, and that routine applied to staff almost as much as it did to the patients. A surviving Stafford Mental Hospital handbook from 1927 shows just how tightly controlled the attendants' lives could be. Staff were instructed to rise at 6 in the morning and retire at 10 at night, and they were not supposed to leave without permission. Male and female attendants were prohibited from associating with one another while on duty, and the handbook expected them to spend the working time with the patients rather than withdrawing into their own rooms. Their role was not simply to watch people, but also keep them occupied and involved in the daily life of the hospital. By the time the old asylum became St George's Hospital and moved further into the 20th century, both mental health care and the institution itself were changing. Although many people were still living there for long periods, we get a rare glimpse of that later world from Vicky Wood, who volunteered at St George's during the early 1980s. Every Wednesday morning, Vicky and another volunteer named Hilda would make their way around the hospital with a trolley carrying sweets, chocolates and small items for the patients. Because many of the people living there remained for considerable periods, Vicky said they soon came to know the regular customers. She remembered the population of the hospital approaching 1,000 people, and recalled being told by staff that some women who entered with postnatal depression remained there for years. She also remembered patients holding on to possessions associated with children from whom they'd been separated. That recollection cannot tell us the circumstances of every individual woman, but it does show how long institutional life could shape somebody's identity and the connection with the world around. And especially the connection with the world outside. Vicky's memories also provide a side of St George's that's easily lost. Well, or at least lost when we look at photographs of the later abandoned building. After taking the trolley through the main wards, the volunteers visited short-stay wards elsewhere in the grounds before eventually reaching the diversional therapy unit. There, patients knitted, sewed, painted, completed jigsaw puzzles and spent time talking together. Vicky particularly remembered a large aviary containing budgies, canaries and ornamental pheasants. That's probably one of the most important things these accounts can give us. St George's existed for almost 2 centuries, and the experience of somebody admitted during the Victorian period could not simply be applied to somebody receiving treatment in there in the 1980s. Treatment changed, language changed too, and so did the hospital, and the hospital changed with it. But some things connect to different periods. Bertha Littleford arrived following bereavement and serious mental decline. She recovered, returned home and later needed the asylum again. Mary Gegg arrived after attempting to take her own life and was able to leave recovered a little more than 2 months later. Decades afterwards, Vicky Wood walked those same hospital buildings, meeting patients whose own histories may have stretched back through the years of institutional life. Vicky Wood walked the same hospital buildings, meeting patients whose own histories may have stretched back through the years of institutional life. And that is what gets lost when St George's is remembered simply as an old asylum or an abandoned hospital. The building is still impressive and its history is important, but the real story was always the people inside it. Some recovered and went home, some returned several times. Some remained for much longer, while generations of nurses, attendants, doctors and volunteers built their own lives around caring for them. The records could not tell us everything those people thought or felt, and where the evidence stops, we have to stop with it. But occasionally a photograph survives, a patient's own sentence appears in a casebook, Or somebody who once worked there leaves behind a memory of an ordinary Wednesday morning pushing a sweet trolley through the wards, and suddenly St George's stops being an institution containing hundreds of anonymous patients and becomes what it always was: thousands of individual human lives, passing through the same building for very different reasons.